In the deepest shadows of European history, where madness and monarchy intertwine, there exists a story so horrifying that chroniclers hesitated to record its full truth. A queen who once danced at the most glittering courts of Christendom would end her days in a fortress of silence, her body consuming itself from within, while an empire rose upon the foundation of her suffering. This is the story of Joanna of Castile, a woman history remembers as La Loca, the mad, but whose final torment transcended any definition of insanity. Her screams echoed through stone corridors as her flesh decayed around a secret so grotesque that even hardened servants fled her presence. What you are about to hear challenges our understanding of royal life, medical ignorance, and the price of power in the 16th century. The year is 1555. In the fortress palace of Tordesillas, nestled along the Duero River in the heart of Castile, a woman lies dying in circumstances that would haunt the Spanish court for generations. She is 75 years old, though disease and decades of imprisonment have transformed her into something barely recognizable as human. The air in her chamber hangs thick with the stench of putrefaction, a smell so overpowering that fresh flowers placed each morning wilt by midday. Servants draw lots to determine who must attend her, and those chosen weep openly at their misfortune. Through the barred windows, life continues in the town below, merchants hawking their wares, children playing in dusty streets, farmers bringing harvest to market. None suspect that above them, in that sealed room, a queen is experiencing a death unlike any other in recorded history. To understand how Joanna arrived at this horrific end, we must travel back more than half a century to a time when she represented the brightest hope of Spanish unity. Born in 1479 in Toledo, she entered the world as the third child of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs whose marriage had unified Spain and whose conquest of Granada would complete the Reconquista. Young Joanna grew up in a court that valued education and piety in equal measure. She studied Latin, philosophy, music, and dance. Contemporary accounts describe her as intellectually gifted, with a particular talent for languages and a beauty that combined her mother's fierce intelligence with her father's political cunning. She was trained from birth to be a diplomatic asset, a living treaty to be deployed in the great game of European alliance building. The world Joanna inhabited was one of staggering transformation. The year before her birth, her parents had married, joining two kingdoms that had warred for centuries. By the time she reached adolescence, Columbus had sailed under her mother's banner, opening an entirely new world to Spanish conquest and colonization. The Inquisition, established by her parents in 1478, had become an instrument of religious uniformity and political control, sending thousands to the flames. Into this world of expansion and religious fervor, Joanna absorbed the lessons of queenship, that duty superseded desire, that marriages were political instruments, and that royal women existed to produce heirs and cement alliances. She accepted these truths with the quiet resignation expected of a princess who would likely never rule in her own right. In 1496, when Joanna was just 16 years old, her fate was sealed by a diplomatic masterstroke. Her parents arranged a double marriage alliance with the House of Habsburg, the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Joanna would marry Philip, Duke of Burgundy and son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, while her brother Juan would wed Philip's sister, Margaret. The arrangement promised to encircle France, Spain's great rival, with Habsburg-allied territories. In August of that year, Joanna set sail from Laredo, accompanied by a vast fleet carrying her dowry and a retinue of over 100 nobles, servants, and priests. The sea journey was treacherous. Storms battered the fleet and several ships were lost. When Joanna finally reached the Netherlands after months of travel, she was exhausted, seasick, and terrified. Yet what awaited her would prove far more dangerous than any storm. Philip of Burgundy was 28 years old, strikingly handsome, and had earned his sobriquet the Handsome through a combination of physical beauty and charming manner. Contemporary portraits show a man with delicate features, long golden hair, and an expression of aristocratic confidence. When Joanna first saw him, something unprecedented happened. She fell desperately, consuming in love. This was not the polite affection expected in royal marriages, but an obsessive passion that would define and ultimately destroy her life. Philip, accustomed to the sophisticated pleasure-seeking Burgundian court, found his Spanish bride exotic and interesting enough for a time. The marriage was consummated almost immediately, with such enthusiasm that chroniclers noted the haste with which the formal ceremonies were abbreviated. For a brief period, Joanna experienced happiness. She adapted to Burgundian court life, learned French and Flemish, and bore Philip a daughter, Eleanor, in 1498. But cracks appeared quickly in this facade of marital harmony. The Burgundian court was notorious for its licentiousness, a stark contrast to the austere Spanish court of Joanna's upbringing. Philip kept numerous mistresses openly, considering it his right as a prince to enjoy the favors of noblewomen and servants alike. Joanna, raised in the strict moral environment of Isabella's court, found this behavior intolerable. Her love for Philip transformed into jealous obsession. She reportedly attacked one of his mistresses with scissors, cutting off the woman's hair in a fit of rage. Courtiers began to whisper that the Spanish princess was unstable, prone to violent outbursts and melancholy silences. Philip, rather than attempting to understand or comfort his wife, used these incidents to marginalize her, painting her as mentally unfit, even as he exploited her royal bloodline for political advantage. Tragedy struck the Spanish royal family in 1497, when Joanna's beloved brother Juan, heir to the unified Spanish throne, died suddenly at 19, possibly from tuberculosis or excessive sexual activity with his new bride. Doctors of the era debated both possibilities. His death placed Juan's pregnant widow next in line, but when she miscarried, the succession passed to Joanna's older sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal. Within a year, Isabella too was dead, dying in childbirth. Her son Miguel survived only 2 years, passing in 1500. Through this cascade of deaths, Joanna found herself transformed from a relatively minor princess into heiress presumptive to the Spanish throne. She was now the link between the Spanish kingdoms and the vast Habsburg Empire, making her the most valuable royal woman in Europe. Philip recognized immediately what this meant. Through his wife, he could claim the Spanish crowns. His treatment of Joanna grew more calculating, more cruel. In 1501, pregnant with her third child, Joanna returned to Spain to be formally recognized as heir by the Cortes of Castile and Aragon. Her mother, Isabella, now visibly aging and exhausted by decades of rule, watched her daughter with growing concern. Isabella recognized in Joanna's desperate love for Philip something dangerous, a vulnerability that could be exploited by ambitious men. Mother and daughter spent months together, during which Isabella attempted to counsel Joanna in the arts of rulership and the necessity of maintaining dignity regardless of personal suffering. But Isabella's stern piety offered little comfort to a woman tormented by her husband's infidelities. When Philip arrived in Spain in 1502, the contrast between the couple was stark. He charmed the Spanish nobility with his gracious manner while privately dismissing them as provincial, while Joanna appeared withdrawn, responding to questions with distant distraction. After the birth of their son Ferdinand in Spain, Philip insisted they return to Burgundy, cutting short Joanna's time with her mother. Isabella watched them depart with foreboding she confided to her confessor. She feared she would never see her daughter again. Back in the Netherlands, Joanna's situation deteriorated rapidly. Philip now treated her with open contempt, keeping her isolated from Spanish attendants and surrounding her with his own people. When she protested his infidelities, he would have her confined to her chambers, sometimes for weeks at a time. Joanna began to exhibit behaviors that her enemies would later use as evidence of madness. She refused to change her clothes, stopped attending Mass, and spent hours staring out windows in silence. Modern psychological analysis suggests these were symptoms of severe depression, possibly complicated by postpartum complications from her multiple pregnancies. But in the early 16th century, such behaviors were interpreted as evidence of mental derangement, particularly in a woman. Philip's supporters spread rumors that Joanna was suffering from the same melancholic madness that had supposedly afflicted her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal. These whispers would prove catastrophic for Joanna's future. In November 1504, Queen Isabella died in Medina del Campo, worn out by illness and worry over the succession. Her death left Joanna as Queen of Castile in her own right, while Ferdinand retained Aragon. Isabella's will attempted to protect her daughter, naming Ferdinand as regent of Castile if Joanna was unwilling or unable to rule, a carefully worded provision that acknowledged Joanna's troubled state while not declaring her incompetent. But Isabella's death removed Joanna's last protector. Philip immediately declared himself King of Castile by right of his marriage, dismissing the will's provisions. He and Joanna returned to Spain in 1506 with an army, prepared to claim the throne by force if necessary. Ferdinand, outmaneuvered and facing the prospect of civil war, reluctantly recognized Philip and Joanna as co-monarchs of Castile and withdrew to Aragon. Joanna, who should have been celebrating her accession to the throne, instead found herself a puppet in her husband's political theater. He paraded her before the Cortes to legitimize his rule, then kept her confined when not needed for ceremonial purposes. The summer of 1506 brought a development that would shatter what remained of Joanna's world. Philip, only 28 years old and in apparent good health, fell suddenly ill after playing a game of pelota in the heat of September. Within days, his condition worsened dramatically. Doctors diagnosed typhoid fever, though some whispered of poison. Philip's Burgundian courtiers blamed Spanish treachery, while Spanish nobles quietly suggested that God had intervened to remove a usurper. As Philip lay dying in Burgos, sweating and delirious, Joanna remained by his bedside, refusing food and sleep. She held his hand as he drew his last breath on September 25, 1506, then remained sitting beside his corpse for hours, unable to accept that he was gone. The man she had loved with such consuming passion, who had tormented and humiliated her for a decade, was dead. And with his death, Joanna's fragile grip on reality began to slip away entirely. What happened in the months following Philip's death has become legend, though contemporary accounts vary in their details. Joanna refused to allow Philip's body to be buried. She had his coffin opened repeatedly to gaze upon his decomposing features, sometimes embracing the corpse. She ordered a funeral procession to move Philip's body from Burgos to Granada, where Spanish monarchs were traditionally interred, but the journey became an endless, nightmarish wandering. The procession traveled only at night, as Joanna declared she could not bear the sun to shine on Philip's coffin. When they stopped at a convent, Joanna reportedly flew into a rage upon learning that nuns resided there, screaming that no women should come near her husband's body, even in death. Monks who witnessed the scene described a queen who seemed possessed, her hair wild, her clothing stained, her eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. The coffin was opened again and again at her command, releasing the stench of putrefaction. All the while, Joanna was pregnant with Philip's final child, her body carrying life even as she trailed death across the Castilian countryside. In March 1507 at Torquemada, Joanna gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, in a convent beside Philip's coffin. Contemporary accounts describe the birth as difficult and the conditions as appalling. The room reeked of decay from the nearby corpse, and Joanna's own hygiene had deteriorated so severely that midwives struggled to assist her. After the birth, Ferdinand, who had been monitoring his daughter's condition with alarm, intervened decisively. He took control of Castile in Joanna's name, declaring himself regent. Joanna and Philip's body were moved to Tordesillas, to a comfortable palace overlooking the Duero River. There, Ferdinand explained to his daughter she could rest and recover. Philip's body was finally interred in the nearby convent of Santa Clara. Joanna was told she was being cared for, protected. In truth, she had been imprisoned. She was 27 years old, a reigning queen in name, a captive in fact. She would remain in Tordesillas for the next 46 years until her death. The early years of Joanna's confinement at Tordesillas were marked by continued deterioration of her mental state. Her father Ferdinand, who ruled Castile as regent, visited occasionally but maintained that his daughter was incapable of governing. Documents from this period describe Joanna's erratic behavior: days spent in complete silence, followed by violent outbursts, refusal to eat for weeks at a time, and an obsessive insistence that Philip was still alive and would return to her. She kept his portrait in her chamber and would speak to it for hours. Her attendants, carefully chosen for their loyalty to Ferdinand, recorded every action, every word, creating a documentary record that justified her continued imprisonment. Modern historians debate whether Joanna was genuinely suffering from severe mental illness, or whether her symptoms were exacerbated or even partially fabricated by those who benefited from her incapacity. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Joanna suffered real psychological trauma, but it was exploited and worsened by her captivity. Ferdinand died in 1516, and Joanna's son Charles, raised in the Netherlands and barely knowing his mother, became King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, ruling the largest empire since Rome. He traveled to Tordesillas to meet with his mother, hoping to have her formally declare him king. The encounter was awkward and painful. Charles, 16 years old and speaking no Spanish, faced a woman who was legally Queen of Castile but existed in a twilight state of captivity. Joanna reportedly recognized her son and showed moments of lucidity, asking about his siblings and expressing concern for his welfare. But she refused to sign any documents transferring power, perhaps understanding that to do so would be to admit her own incapacity. Charles left troubled, but took no action to free his mother. Like his grandfather before him, he found Joanna's imprisonment politically convenient. Her legal status as queen gave legitimacy to his rule, while her incapacity prevented her from challenging his authority. The years passed with crushing monotony. Joanna's world contracted to a few rooms in the Tordesillas palace. She was attended by servants who reported her every action to Charles's court. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, remained with her for several years, one of the few bright moments in Joanna's captivity. Contemporary accounts suggest that Joanna was a loving, even doting mother to Catherine when lucid, teaching her Latin and music. But Catherine was eventually taken away to be raised properly at court, leaving Joanna alone again. The isolation was profound and deliberate. Joanna was forbidden from receiving visitors without permission, could not send or receive correspondence freely, and had no say in the management of her household. She existed in a state of royal limbo, too important to be forgotten, too inconvenient to be freed, suspended between life and death, queenship and imprisonment. In 1520, Joanna's captivity was briefly disrupted by the Comuneros Revolt, an uprising of Castilian towns against Charles's imperial taxation and foreign councillors. Rebels captured Tordesillas and attempted to use Joanna as a figurehead for their cause, presenting her with documents to sign that would legitimize their rebellion. It was a moment of extraordinary possibility. Joanna could have reclaimed her throne, could have sided with her subjects against a son who had never known her. Witnesses describe a woman who seemed to understand what was happening, who asked intelligent questions about the rebels' goals and her son's location. Some historians see in this episode evidence that Joanna had never been as mad as her captors claimed. But ultimately, whether from genuine confusion, maternal loyalty, or shrewd political calculation, Joanna refused to sign the rebels' documents. The revolt was crushed brutally, and Joanna's conditions of confinement became even more severe. She had missed her chance, if it had ever truly existed, for freedom. The 1520s and 1530s passed in increasing darkness for Joanna. As Charles's empire expanded to include vast territories in the Americas, as the Protestant Reformation tore Europe apart, as Spain became the dominant power in Christendom, the woman who was legally Queen of Castile sat in Tordesillas, aging invisibly. She stopped attending Mass, claiming she could not take communion properly. She developed obsessive rituals around food, sometimes refusing to eat for days. then gorging herself. Her personal hygiene, which had been problematic since Philip's death, deteriorated further. She refused to change clothes or bathe, and servants had to wait until she slept to clean her or alter her garments. These behaviors, documented meticulously by her keepers, reinforced the narrative of madness, but they also suggest a woman exercising the only control she had left over her own body in defiance of those who controlled everything else. In her later years, Joanna developed what attendants described as a religious fervor mixed with heretical beliefs. She claimed to receive visions, though whether these were genuine mystical experiences, hallucinations brought on by malnutrition and isolation, or desperate attempts to find meaning in captivity, we cannot know. She spoke of conversations with saints and deceased relatives. At times, she expressed doubt about core Catholic doctrines, questioning the necessity of confession and the authority of priests. In any other person of her era, such statements would have brought the Inquisition's attention. But Joanna's royal status and carefully maintained isolation protected her from such consequences. Her keepers simply added these episodes to their reports, further evidence of a disordered mind. In truth, Joanna may have been reaching toward the only form of freedom available to her, the inner life of the spirit, where even jailers could not fully follow. By the 1540s, Joanna was in her 60s, ancient by 16th century standards. Decades of poor diet, lack of exercise, and psychological torment had ravaged her body. Reports from this period describe a woman who had become skeletal, her once beautiful features haggard and worn. Her hair, which she refused to allow servants to cut or properly clean, hung in matted tangles. Her teeth, like those of most people in that era but worse due to neglect, had rotted and fallen out, making eating difficult and painful. She suffered from what was probably severe arthritis, moving slowly and with obvious pain. Digestive problems plagued her, likely related to her erratic eating patterns and poor nutrition. Through all of this, she remained queen in name, her signature still theoretically required for certain documents, though Charles's government had long since found ways to rule without her actual participation. It was in these final years that the horror that would define Joanna's legend began to manifest. The exact timing is unclear from surviving records, but sometime in the early 1550s, Joanna developed what contemporary accounts describe as a putrid infection of the womb. The symptoms began subtly, irregular bleeding, which in a woman of her age might not have seemed immediately alarming, but the bleeding continued, became more profuse, and was accompanied by cramping pains that left Joanna gasping and crying out. An odor began to emanate from her body, foul and sickly sweet, the unmistakable smell of infected necrotic flesh. Her attendants, already reluctant to approach too closely, now found their duty almost unbearable. They would stand at the threshold of her chamber, calling to her from a distance, avoiding physical contact whenever possible. The physicians summoned to examine Joanna faced an almost impossible task. Medical understanding of gynecological conditions in the 16th century was primitive and often fatally wrong. Female anatomy was poorly understood. Many doctors still adhered to theories derived from ancient Greek texts that bore little relation to reality. Moreover, examining a queen intimately was fraught with protocol and danger. The doctors who attended Joanna had to work through servants, relying on second-hand descriptions and observations. When they did examine her directly, they did so with extraordinary haste, minimizing physical contact. What they reported to Charles's court was alarming. The queen suffered from an infection deep within the womb, likely caused by retained products from her last pregnancy nearly 50 years earlier, or perhaps a tumor that had turned cancerous, or possibly an injury that had never properly healed. The infection, they warned, was spreading, and there was little they could do to stop it. Treatment options in the mid-16th century for such a condition were barbaric and largely ineffective. Doctors attempted to administer douches of various concoctions, mixtures of wine, vinegar, honey, and herbs forced into the vaginal canal in hopes of cleansing the infection. These treatments were agonizing and only worsened the inflammation. They prescribed bleeding, opening veins to let out bad humors, which weakened Joanna further. They applied poultices to her lower abdomen, hot compresses meant to draw out the infection, but which only intensified her pain. Nothing worked. The infection continued to progress, eating away at tissue, spreading its poison through her body. Joanna developed a constant low-grade fever that would spike unpredictably, sending her into bouts of delirium. The pain became so severe that she could no longer walk, confined now not just by political imprisonment, but by physical incapacity. As weeks became months, the true horror of Joanna's condition became apparent. The infection was not simply killing her, it was causing her body to rot from the inside while she still lived. The discharge from her womb became increasingly foul, dark blood mixed with pus and fragments of dead tissue. The smell intensified, penetrating every fabric, every corner of her chamber. Fresh flowers brought in each morning would be brown and wilted by midday, unable to survive in that atmosphere of decay. Incense burned constantly, but even its heavy smoke could not mask the underlying stench. Servants who attended Joanna would emerge retching, their clothes reeking so badly that they would burn them rather than attempt to wash them. The stone walls of her chamber began to show dark stains of dampness, as if the rot were leaching into the very building itself. The nights were worst. In the darkness, as fever scrambled her thoughts, Joanna would scream. These were not the shouts of delirium, but wails of pure agony. Sounds that witnesses struggled to describe, inhuman, tortured, the voice of someone experiencing suffering beyond the capacity of language to express. The screams echoed through the palace corridors, penetrating even thick stone walls. Servants sleeping in distant rooms would wake in terror. Guards stationed outside would cross themselves and pray. The townspeople of Tordesillas, hearing those distant cries carrying on the night wind, crossed themselves and hurried past the palace walls. Stories began to spread. The mad queen was being tortured by demons, or was transforming into something not quite human, or was being punished by God for unnamed sins. The screaming would continue for hours, until exhaustion or unconsciousness finally granted Joanna a respite. It was during one of these nighttime episodes that a servant named Maria Gonzalez, whom records identify as having attended Joanna for over a decade, witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Gonzalez had been summoned to change the blood-soaked linens beneath the queen. As she worked, trying to be gentle while also moving quickly to minimize her exposure to the stench, she noticed movement in the soiled cloths she had just removed. In the candlelight, she saw them, small, pale worms, writhing in the bloody discharge. The linens were alive with them, dozens of larvae feeding on the necrotic tissue that was sloughing away from Joanna's rotting womb. Gonzalez dropped the linens and fled the chamber, hysterical, crossing herself repeatedly and crying that the queen was being devoured from within while she still lived. The presence of maggots in Joanna's infection, while horrifying, was not actually as supernatural as it seemed to 16th century observers. What Gonzalez had witnessed was miasis, the infestation of living tissue by fly larvae. In warm weather, flies would have been attracted to the smell of infection, entering the palace through windows or other openings. They would have laid their eggs in the discharge and dead tissue around Joanna's genital area, and these eggs would have hatched into the larvae Gonzalez saw. In modern understanding, certain types of maggots actually help clean wounds by consuming dead tissue and leaving healthy flesh untouched. Maggot therapy would be medically used in later centuries. But in 1555, in the fevered imagination of the Counter-Reformation, these worms took on demonic significance. They were seen as evidence of corruption in both the physical and spiritual sense, a visible manifestation of rot that went beyond the merely bodily. Word of the worms spread through the palace and then beyond, despite attempts to maintain secrecy. Servants whispered to their families, who told others in the town. The story grew with each telling. Some claimed the worms were as large as snakes, that they crawled from the queen's body and had to be gathered in buckets, that they spoke with demonic voices. Letters sent from courtiers in Tordesillas to Charles's court mentioned the queen's monstrous affliction and unnatural suffering. A culture steeped in religious symbolism saw spiritual meaning in physical horror. Joanna's rotting womb was interpreted as divine commentary on her marriage, on her supposed madness, on the cursed nature of her bloodline. Some whispered that this was punishment for the sins of her ancestors, for Ferdinand and Isabella's brutal persecution of Jews and Muslims, for the conquest of the Indies. Others saw it as judgment on Joanna herself, though what sins she could have committed while imprisoned for half a century remained unclear. The metaphor of the rotting womb was particularly resonant and terrible. Joanna had been a queen, but more importantly, she had been a vessel for dynasty. Through her body had passed the continuation of two great houses, Habsburg and Trastamara. She had borne 6 children who survived infancy, including Charles V, the most powerful man in Christendom, and Ferdinand, who would succeed him as emperor. Her grandchildren through Charles included Philip II of Spain, who would rule an empire on which the sun never set. Yet the womb that had produced this world-spanning dynasty was now consuming itself, rotting and filling with worms, while its products sat on thrones across Europe. The symbolism was inescapable and terrifying. What did it mean that the source of so much power should end in such corruption? Was this God's judgment on the Habsburg Spanish Empire itself, a sign that something was rotten at its very foundation? Religious interpreters of the time offered various explanations, all colored by Counter-Reformation theology. Some priests suggested that Joanna was being purified through suffering, that her agonies were a form of purgatory endured while still living, cleansing her soul for heaven. This interpretation cast her as a kind of holy sufferer, a martyr to dynastic duty. Others took a darker view, arguing that her condition demonstrated the wages of sin, though they were vague about which sins specifically, given Joanna's decades of isolated captivity. A few brave or foolish commentators suggested that the rotting womb symbolized the rottenness of a political system that had imprisoned a rightful queen for half a century, that God was making visible in Joanna's body the moral decay of a monarchy built on expedience rather than justice. These voices were quickly silenced, their comments deemed dangerously seditious. As the infection progressed, Joanna's lucid moments became increasingly rare, separated by longer and longer periods of delirium. When conscious, she displayed an awareness of her condition that was perhaps more terrible than unconsciousness would have been. She knew she was dying, knew the manner of her dying was grotesque and humiliating. In one documented exchange from late 1554, she asked her confessor directly whether she was being punished, whether this suffering had meaning. The confessor, a Dominican named Fray Juan de Avila, apparently struggled to answer, eventually offering platitudes about the mysterious ways of God and the purifying nature of suffering. Joanna, even in her weakened state, reportedly saw through this evasion, saying simply, "You do not know, no one knows." It was one of her last recorded statements of clarity, a moment of insight that cut through decades of religious justification and political expedience to reach a simple, terrible truth. Her suffering was meaningless, except as suffering. Her dying prolonged and horrible, for no purpose anyone could articulate. The physicians, desperate to be seen as doing something, continued their futile treatments. They attempted more aggressive douching, using stronger solutions that burned and blistered. They prescribed mercury, that favorite panacea of early modern medicine, which they administered both topically and internally, adding heavy metal poisoning to Joanna's existing miseries. They tried cauterization, using heated instruments to burn away infected tissue, a procedure that left Joanna screaming for hours afterward and accomplished nothing except increasing her agony. Some recommended amputation of the womb itself, a surgery that was virtually always fatal in that era, and that would have been technically impossible given the extent of internal infection. The physicians' reports from this period make grim reading. Long lists of treatments attempted, all failing, the tone shifting from confident recommendation to desperate experimentation to resigned documentation of decline. They knew they were watching a woman die horribly and could do nothing to ease her passage. Through the autumn of 1554 and into early 1555, Joanna's condition deteriorated steadily. The infection spread beyond her reproductive organs, entering her bloodstream and causing sepsis. Fever became constant, punctuated by periods of rigors, violent shaking chills that left her exhausted. Her body began to exhibit the signs of systemic organ failure. Her skin took on a yellowish tint as her liver struggled with the burden of toxins. Her feet and legs swelled with edema as her kidneys began to fail. She developed bed sores from lying immobile, which themselves became infected, adding to her burden of rot. Her breathing became labored and rapid, the work of lungs trying to oxygenate blood that could no longer carry enough oxygen. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her periods of awareness growing shorter, more confused. When she spoke, it was often in fragmented sentences, mixing Latin prayers with Spanish endearments to long-dead family members, calling for her mother, for Philip, for her children. In her final weeks, Joanna received visitors she had not seen in years, or perhaps saw them only in her own mind. She spoke to her mother Isabella, as if the great queen sat beside her bed and seemed to be having coherent conversations, responding to words no one else could hear. She addressed Philip, sometimes with the desperate love of their early marriage, sometimes with bitter accusations of betrayal. She asked repeatedly about her children, especially Charles, seeming not to understand or remember that he was now emperor and king, one of the most powerful men in the world. In some of her clearer moments, she recognized the attendants around her bed and thanked them for their service, apologizing with heartbreaking courtesy for the trouble her illness caused them. These moments of grace, of the essential dignity that had survived half a century of imprisonment and degradation, moved even hardened servants to tears. Charles, informed of his mother's imminent death, did not come to Tordesillas. He was engaged in complicated political and military affairs, struggling to manage an empire that stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to the Americas. He sent letters expressing concern and instructing that his mother be given every comfort. But he did not make the journey to see her one final time. His sister Eleanor, who had been born during Joanna's nightmare journey with Philip's corpse, had died the previous year. His brother Ferdinand was in Austria. The younger children had scattered across Europe to various thrones and matches. Joanna would die attended by servants and priests, but not by family. The woman who had given birth to emperors and kings, whose body had been the vessel through which the greatest dynasty of the age had flowed, would leave the world alone, separated from those she had borne. On April 12th, 1555, Good Friday, Joanna's struggle finally ended. She was 75 years old and had been imprisoned for 46 years. The specific circumstances of her death are recorded by several sources. As morning light filtered through the barred windows of her chamber, Joanna experienced a moment of clarity. She asked for a crucifix, which was brought to her, and she held it with strength that surprised her attendants. She prayed aloud in Latin, the language of her educated youth, reciting verses from the Psalms. Her voice, weakened by months of screaming, was barely audible. Then she seemed to relax, to accept what was coming. She asked her confessor for absolution one final time, received it, and with the crucifix still clutched to her chest, stopped breathing. There was no struggle at the end, no final scream, only silence after so much suffering. The woman who had been called La Loca for half a century died lucid, faithful, and alone. The immediate aftermath of Joanna's death revealed the extent to which her captors feared her even in death. The room was sealed immediately, and guards were posted. No one was allowed to enter until Charles's personal representatives arrived from Valladolid to take charge of the body and ensure proper handling of the late Queen's remains. When these officials finally entered the death chamber days later, they found conditions that even hardened courtiers struggled to describe in their reports. The stench had intensified beyond anything experienced while Joanna lived, the full extent of internal decomposition becoming apparent now that her body's systems had completely ceased functioning. The bed and floor around it were stained with the discharge and blood of her final days. The worms, deprived of their living host, had begun to disperse, seeking new sources of food, and the room was alive with them. One report noted that officials had to wear cloth soaked in vinegar over their faces to enter at all, and several rushed out to vomit. The preparation of Joanna's body for burial presented unprecedented challenges. Normally, royal bodies were embalmed, internal organs removed, the body cavity filled with preservatives, the skin treated to slow decay. But Joanna's condition made standard embalming procedures impossible. The infection had caused such extensive internal damage that traditional methods couldn't be applied safely or effectively. Eventually, embalmers settled for external treatment only, washing the body as thoroughly as possible with wine and vinegar, wrapping it in cloths soaked in myrrh and other preservatives, then sealing it in a lead-lined coffin as quickly as possible. Even with these measures, those who handled the body reported that the smell penetrated everything, that they felt contaminated by contact with such profound decay. Several of the servants involved reportedly fell ill afterward, though whether from actual infection or psychological trauma is impossible to determine from surviving records. The funeral arrangements reflected Joanna's peculiar status. She had been Queen of Castile for nearly 50 years, yet had never truly ruled. She was mother and grandmother to emperors, yet had lived and died a prisoner. The ceremony at Tordesillas was modest, attended by local nobles and religious officials, but by none of the great figures of the Spanish court. Her body was interred temporarily in the convent of Santa Clara at Tordesillas, the same convent where Philip's body had rested before its final transfer to Granada. Joanna would lie there beside her long-dead husband for decades, before her grandson, Philip II, finally arranged for their bodies to be moved to the Royal Chapel in Granada in 1574, fulfilling the wish Joanna had expressed over 60 years earlier. Even in death, her desires were subject to the convenience of her male relatives, her final resting place determined not by her wishes, but by dynastic politics. The official announcements of Joanna's death were carefully crafted exercises in political messaging. Charles's court publicized that the Queen Mother had died peacefully after years of illness, surrounded by the comforts of religion and attended by loyal servants. There was no mention of the specific nature of her illness, no reference to the horror of her final months. The narrative presented was of a woman who had been mentally unwell but cared for with great devotion by her son, who had ensured she lived out her days in appropriate dignity. This version of events would become the official history for centuries. Letters were sent to courts across Europe announcing the death of Her Majesty Queen Joanna of Castile, with appropriate expressions of mourning and requests for prayers for her soul. Most monarchs responded with formulaic condolences, many having forgotten that the mad Spanish queen had still been alive. But unofficial accounts tell a different story. Letters between Spanish nobles, reports from Tordesillas residents to relatives in other cities, and later memoirs all contain references to the true nature of Joanna's death. These accounts speak of supernatural occurrences surrounding her passing. Lights seen in her chamber windows at midnight, sounds of screaming that continued even after her death, servants who went mad after attending her deathbed. While such stories must be viewed with skepticism, they reveal the profound psychological impact of Joanna's suffering on those who witnessed it. The horror was so extreme that people struggled to process it through normal understanding and instead reached for supernatural explanations. The story of the rotting womb and the worms became part of Spanish folk legend, whispered about in taverns and recorded in chronicles that official histories tried to suppress. The question that haunted Spain in the aftermath of Joanna's death was one that no one dared ask openly. Had she really been mad? For 46 years, her imprisonment had been justified by her supposed insanity, yet the accounts of her final months describe someone who, even in extreme physical agony, displayed moments of clarity, piety, and grace. Had a sane woman been imprisoned for half a century because her grief and her husband's ambition were conveniently labeled as madness? Modern psychiatric analysis of historical sources suggests that Joanna likely suffered from what we would now call severe depression, possibly complicated by brief psychotic episodes brought on by extreme stress. But depression is not the same as the complete incapacity claimed by those who kept her imprisoned. The suspicion lingered that Joanna's madness had been as much a political construct as a medical reality, a convenient justification for male relatives to rule in her name while denying her agency. The legacy of Joanna's life and death extended far beyond Spain. She became a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rule, about the instability supposedly inherent in women's nature. For centuries, writers would point to Joanna the Mad as evidence that women were temperamentally unsuited to power, that their emotions could too easily overwhelm their reason. This narrative would be used to justify the exclusion of women from power across Europe. At the same time, her story became a romantic legend, the queen driven mad by love, a tragic figure out of classical drama. Plays, poems, and later operas would tell her story, usually focusing on her love for Philip and her wandering with his corpse, conveniently omitting the decades of imprisonment and the horror of her final illness. These romantic retellings transformed Joanna into a symbol rather than a person, stripping away the complex reality of her life. But it was the manner of her death that proved most enduring in collective memory. The image of the rotting womb, the worms consuming her from within, achieved a kind of mythic status. It was too horrible to forget, too symbolically resonant to remain merely medical fact. Theologians debated its meaning. Artists depicted it in ways both explicit and allegorical. The story was told to young women as a warning, though exactly what it warned against remained unclear. Was it a caution against excessive passion, as Joanna's love for Philip had supposedly destroyed her, against disobedience to male authority, against the dangers of queenship itself? Or was it simply a reminder of the body's capacity for horror, a memento mori in the most literal sense? In the royal courts of Europe, Joanna's death prompted quiet reflection on the treatment of inconvenient female rulers. Other women had been imprisoned, declared mad, or otherwise neutralized when politically expedient. Joanna was not unique in that regard, but the specifics of her case, the duration of her captivity, and especially the horror of her final illness raised uncomfortable questions. If Joanna had been properly cared for, would she have died in such agony? If she had been allowed appropriate medical treatment, freedom of movement, contact with family, would the infection that killed her have developed at all? These questions went largely unasked in official contexts, but they lingered in private correspondence and would surface again in later centuries as the rights of imprisoned royalty came under scrutiny. The physicians who had attended Joanna spent considerable effort after her death writing accounts that justified their treatments and explained their failures. These medical treatises, ostensibly about gynecological disease, were actually exercises in defensive medicine, attempts to explain why they had been unable to save the queen or even ease her suffering. They blamed the patient, suggesting that her long-standing mental instability had weakened her physical constitution. They blamed the lateness of their involvement, claiming the infection was already too advanced when they were finally called. They blamed the limitations of medical knowledge, portraying themselves as dedicated practitioners struggling against impossible odds. These self-justifying accounts actually provide valuable historical information about the progression of Joanna's illness, but they must be read with understanding that their authors were primarily concerned with protecting their own reputations. The servants who had attended Joanna in her final months faced their own struggles. Several gave testimony to church officials, describing what they had witnessed and seeking spiritual counsel about what it meant. Maria Gonzalez, who had seen the worms, reportedly never recovered her peace of mind, eventually entering a convent where she spent the rest of her life in prayer and penance, convinced she had witnessed divine judgment. Others simply tried to forget, refusing to speak of their time attending the dying queen. A few became minor celebrities of a sort, trading on their first-hand experience of the horror to gain attention at court or in local society. Their accounts, while problematic in various ways, remain some of our most detailed sources for understanding what actually occurred in that sealed room in Tordesillas during the spring of 1555. In the centuries following Joanna's death, attitudes toward her life and legacy shifted repeatedly. During the Enlightenment, rationalist thinkers re-examined her case, and many concluded that she had been the victim of dynastic politics rather than genuinely mad. Romantic writers of the 19th century embraced her as a tragic heroine, focusing on the love story while still emphasizing her supposed insanity. In the early 20th century, as women's rights movements gained strength, feminist historians began to reconsider Joanna's story more critically, seeing in her imprisonment an example of how inconvenient women were labeled mad and removed from power. Modern scholarship, benefiting from better understanding of both history and psychology, generally views Joanna as someone who suffered from genuine mental health issues that were then exploited and exacerbated by those around her for political gain. The medical aspects of Joanna's death have also been subject to changing interpretation. Modern gynecologists examining the historical descriptions of her final illness have proposed various diagnoses. Some suggest she suffered from cervical or endometrial cancer that became necrotic as it advanced. Others point to the possibility of retained placental tissue from her last pregnancy that became infected decades later, an extremely rare but documented occurrence. Still others suggest a combination of factors: undiagnosed prolapse of the uterus, chronic infection, possibly complicated by sexually transmitted disease from Philip's many affairs years earlier. The presence of maggots, while horrifying, actually suggests that some of the tissue was already necrotic, dead but not yet expelled from the body, creating an environment where fly larvae could thrive. Whatever the exact cause, modern medical experts agree that Joanna's suffering was extreme and that 16th century medicine was not only unable to help, but actually made things worse through many of its interventions. The symbolic power of Joanna's rotting womb has proven remarkably durable across centuries. It has been invoked by writers as diverse as feminist theorists, analyzing the violence done to women's bodies by patriarchal systems, historians examining the decline of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, and literary critics exploring the intersection of body and power in early modern Europe. The image captures something essential about the violence that power does to those caught in its machinery. Joanna's body literally consumed itself in the service of a dynasty that had no use for her except as a vessel. That the vessel should rot while still containing life, that the womb which had produced emperors should fill with worms. This irony is too perfect, too terrible to be merely coincidental. It speaks to something profound about the costs of power, paid disproportionately by those who wield it least. In Spain itself, Joanna's memory has undergone particular evolution. During the Franco era, she was largely ignored. Her story of royal female imprisonment was uncomfortably resonant in a dictatorship that strictly controlled women's roles. After Franco's death and Spain's transition to democracy, interest in Joanna revived. Historians, artists, and popular culture began to re-examine her story, often emphasizing the injustice of her captivity and questioning the narrative of madness. In 2001, the film Juana la Loca, directed by Vicente Aranda, brought her story to a new generation, presenting a sympathetic portrait of a woman destroyed by love and male ambition. The movie sparked renewed scholarly interest and public debate about historical female figures who had been dismissed as mad. Joanna came to be seen as a symbol of female victimization, but also of survival. She endured 46 years of imprisonment and still retained enough self to die with dignity, clutching a crucifix and praying in Latin. The question of whether Joanna was truly mad has become, in many ways, less important than what her story reveals about the treatment of women who threatened male power structures. Whether or not she suffered from genuine mental illness, and evidence suggests she did experience periods of severe psychological disturbance, the fact remains that her condition was used as justification for a lifetime of imprisonment. She was never allowed to rule, never given a chance to prove or disprove her capacity for governance. Her symptoms were documented meticulously by those who benefited from her incapacity, while alternative narratives of a woman responding rationally to impossible circumstances were suppressed. The label of madness became self-fulfilling, as isolation and lack of autonomy worsened any underlying condition. In this sense, whether Joanna was mad or not becomes almost secondary to the question of what madness meant in her context: a tool of political control, a way of rendering inconvenient women voiceless. The horror of Joanna's final illness takes on additional meaning when viewed through this lens. Her body literally fell apart, rotted from within, while she remained conscious and aware. It is tempting to read this as metaphor, the cost of decades of imprisonment and denial of agency manifesting in physical decay. But Joanna's suffering was not metaphor, it was hideously real. The temptation to find symbolic meaning in her rotting womb, to see it as divine judgment or cosmic irony or symbolic commentary, risks obscuring the simple, terrible fact of a woman dying in agony. Before she was a symbol, she was a person. Before her death became legend, it was experience. The screams that echoed through Tordesillas in the spring of 1555 were not metaphors. They were the sounds of someone suffering beyond the limits of what human beings should have to endure. Yet we cannot entirely separate the symbolic from the real in Joanna's case, because her entire life was lived at that intersection. She was both a real woman and a playing piece in dynastic politics. Her body was her own, but it was also the property of the state, valued for its capacity to produce heirs. Her mind was her own, but its contents mattered only insofar as they affected her political utility. When she died, her death was simultaneously a personal tragedy and a political event, an individual suffering and a historical moment. The rotting of her womb was a medical condition, but it was also a commentary, written by history, by chance, by the irony of circumstance, on what her life had been. The woman who had been valuable only for what her body could produce died with that body consuming itself, turning inward, destroying itself from within. In the end, what are we to make of Joanna of Castile? She was born to privilege, educated and cultured, married to a man she loved with consuming passion. She should have been queen in fact as well as name, should have ruled one of Europe's greatest kingdoms. Instead, she spent most of her adult life imprisoned, watching from barred windows as her sons built empires. She suffered the loss of those she loved, the betrayal of those she trusted, the cruelty of those charged with her care. And finally, she endured a death so horrible that it became legend, her body literally rotting away while she remained conscious, her final months a nightmare of pain and horror. History remembers her primarily for her supposed madness and for the grotesque circumstances of her death, but perhaps we should remember her instead for her survival, for enduring 46 years of captivity without losing herself entirely, for dying with enough presence of mind to pray and to forgive, for maintaining some core of dignity through experiences that might have destroyed anyone. The story of Joanna of Castile, the Spanish queen whose womb rotted and filled with worms, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the body. It reminds us that history is not only made in battles and treaties, but also in sealed rooms where inconvenient women are hidden away. It shows us that the cost of empire is sometimes paid in the suffering of those who gave it life, but were denied its benefits. And it demonstrates that the body, that most personal and immediate thing, can become a site of political struggle, its health or illness, sanity or madness, interpreted and controlled by forces beyond individual agency. Joanna's rotting womb has become symbol and legend, but we must not forget that it was first and foremost her flesh, her pain, her death. In remembering the horror, we honor the woman who suffered it, not as La Loca, the mad, but as Joanna, Queen of Castile, who deserved better than history gave her and who died alone, in agony, while the dynasty she had birthed ruled the world.